I noticed that the title of your presentation for the conference references both values in action and virtuous leaders. So can we talk a little bit first about what values in action is, and then go on to the second, to virtuous leaders. So we could start with the values in action work.
Okay. Well, go ahead. You can start.
Okay. So the VA Institute on Character is a nonprofit organization that we started about 12 years ago. And the purpose of that was to start to create a science, to help science weigh in on what's best about human beings and how do we use those best characteristics to build our best lives as individuals, but also together. And so we knew that that work in building a new science was going to be long-term and substantive, and that it would require an organization of its own to sponsor and host and lead and guide that work over a long period of time. So we created a nonprofit to do that, and that's really what we've been doing, is trying to advance the field of understanding from a scientific point of view on top of what we understand otherwise about what's best about us. We're trying to take that understanding and advance practices that coaches can use, individuals use in their own personal growth, people use in business development, employee development, leadership development, etc., really in all walks of life.
So, and if I understand right, the genesis of this came out of both of your work as coaches and in the field of coaching as it was developing. Is that right?
It was very much related. We first, what happened was Marty Seligman, who is now known as the father of positive psychology, was at that time in 1999, he was the president of the American Psychological Association. And actually, the way this story goes is we were working on trying to develop, actually, in a practical ethics center. And so I got in touch with Marty to start to explore what might be an intersection between what he was conceiving of as a positive psychology and what we were trying to aim at, is a center that would actually help people resolve ethical dilemmas more ethically, in a practical way. And so that's where we got started. One thing led to another, and then over time, the advice that was given to us was that what was probably the most important contribution we could make, bigger than starting an ethics center, bigger than starting a particular program, would be to lay the intellectual groundwork and foundation for the science and practice of understanding what's best about people and how how those best characteristics get played out to really tilt, the way I thought of it back then, and at one of our first retreats, the way I put it, was I really saw it as an opportunity to build a fulcrum around which humanity could tip to its better nature. And so I think that's really what we were doing. And yes, we both are licensed clinical psychologists, and we had a coaching company, and Donna can talk about that.
It's a good question, though, because I think that it happened concurrently, that we were invested in developing a coaching process and a coaching company that was using technology and informed by positive psychology. And so the research and the movement really informed the way we developed our coaching model. So it's it was a key ingredient, really, to the way that we helped train coaches, and then people could discover what individual strengths were being expressed by the people that they were coaching and how they could use that to create better lives for themselves.
And if I understand it, one of the things that came out of this was an instrument for measuring.
Mm-hmm.
And how can you talk about that a little bit and how central that is to the work?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a great question, because what we're about is the science and practice. And sometimes science leads practice, and sometimes, and much of practice, as much as we want it to be evidence-based, and as hard as we try to be evidence-based in our practice, science has really only proven so much. And so we can be evidence-based, but a lot of what we have to do is still the art, and we have to use our judgment and our intuition and kind of draw upon our skills. Now, the instrument is a scientific way of a person identifying what strengths are represented most in themselves.
Scientific meaning
it's based in science. Yeah. It's based in lots of research on which are called psychometric research, meaning that it's been shown to be reliable, which means that time after time it's reasonably reliable in terms of the results that you get, and that it's valid. It measures what it's supposed to measure. And so now some people in clinical practice they do not use the survey itself, but they use the language and they use the nomenclature. They use what is called the VIA classification, which identifies 24 fundamental character strains, kind of the building blocks of what are our best characteristics. And those 24 strengths are then categorized into 6 different higher order categories. And so sometimes what people do is they use that language with people to start a growth promoting discussion. We think it's a good idea. Certainly for researchers, you need a scientifically valid way of measuring things to study it. And we think it's a good idea also for practitioners to help people. It's just so, it's easy, and we offer it for free to people. And so we think it's, some people say, well, it's a lot of questions, but really it takes, 30 minutes plus or minus. And so to take 30 minutes of your life to discover some fundamental things about who you are as a person, we think it takes it the step beyond the conversation that was occurring before we created that tool, which were people were talking about their strengths.
Yeah, I would agree with you with this tool as with others. I think that there's an enormous value in giving somebody who, presumably a client who's coming new to this, some access point, some entree to the language base even of what you're using. Even if it's not definitive, even if it, and I can see from looking at your site and reading some of your materials that it's flexible and that you understand that things change over time. But giving them a way to begin to come in, I think is really helpful.
The other thing about it that I think is interesting is that it's a tool that measures self-perception. And I think what's really curious about it is that people take that and they're sometimes very blind, even when they've responded to the questions, they're very blind to the strengths that come out very high for them. So it's a very useful tool for people to sort of really get a sense of, what they see in themselves, but not necessarily really see in themselves. It's really useful that way.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying in coaching, we're all trying to get people to get new insight, to get increased self-awareness, and anything that's going to help us with that. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Can I shift over and ask you what virtuous leaders means?
Well, virtuous leaders is really primarily the domain and of our our co-presenter, Dick Kilberg. And it's not really so much a term that we've created, or it's not what we study and write about, but I could tell you from our point of view what we think of that.
Maybe I would shift the question and say, where's the intersection between Dick's work on virtuous leaders and your work with the VIA?
Maybe I could add a little bit here. So
Alter my question if that helps. I'm not attached to it.
So I think that if virtuous leaders are leaders who bring out the best of themselves, and in that way bring out the best in their coworkers and employees, then I think that our work is a complement to that, because it's about what makes you the best at what you do and who you are. It's really core to who you are. And I think central to that is how leaders begin to understand and know what's good and best in their employees. And it's that relationship between the two, I think, that is the turning point between organizations that survive and organizations that thrive together.
So if I'm understanding you, the recognition of the importance of identifying values and identifying character strengths is actually a building block or an entree point for an organization to go forward into that larger field.
Okay. And I would add to that so there's research that has come out, and first the field of leadership tried to identify are there kind of personality characteristics or particular talents or skills that all leaders have, and that didn't really pan out real well, because leaders come in all shapes and sizes. What's very important from our point of view is also to recognize that leadership is also tied to the circumstance, the conditions. So we each have qualities and characteristics, we call them character strengths, that are particularly relevant depending on who else is in the room at the time and what the task at hand is. And so if you think of a typical team meeting in which there's a discussion that is moving forward, a discussion might start with a posing of an issue or a problem we need to address, or an aspiration we're striving towards a goal, and it might start with people throwing out ideas and general discussion, and so people who have, let's say, creativity and curiosity and kind of the knowledge-seeking strengths may be the ones who lead the discussion at that point. They're conditional leaders at that point in time. It's important for them to know that about themselves. It's important for the other people in the room to know that about themselves, to look to them at that point and to make room for them at that point to lead a discussion, even if it's for a minute. But that minute of leadership is very critical to the overall outcome of the process. And then you can imagine, again, a typical meeting, and down the road at some point lots of stuff has been thrown out, and it's really helpful to have somebody who has perspective as one of their top strengths, to be able to start sorting through everything, summarizing, for the team, here's what I've kind of heard today, here are some next steps we could take. Somebody who has prudence as a top strength. People with prudence are very planful. They're the people who go, what are the next steps? So I think conditional. We tend to think of leadership as positional, and in fact there are lots of positions where your position, your job description is to lead other people. But in reality, I think, when we really look at successful organizations and successful teams, everybody is inspiring everyone else all the time. And so we're all leaders. And it's important to know that, and I think character strengths helps people understand, well, how and when would I be a leader? Because they don't think of themselves, maybe because they don't have the position of a leader, but they do encounter the conditions in which they need to be a leader.
Yeah, it's an inclusive, a very inclusive model, and it's broadening the definition of leadership in a really, really kind of elegant way. Very cool. What do you see as the sort of frontiers of your work? Where do you think you're going next? What's the cutting edge?
Well, I'll say part of where we're going is so character strength sort of, it covers many different areas, and if you think about coaching, it covers all areas of coaching. But one area that we've been focusing primarily recently on two areas. One in the area of organizational development. So how is it that people, as Neal was talking about, what are the roles of leaders, and how do those groups come together in the most effective and productive ways? And then the other area that we're really focusing on is in education. And education is ripe for new and innovative ways to tap into kids' level of engagement, interest in school, and not just the kids themselves, but the whole culture of the school. So how teachers reflect on who they are and why they're there and what they bring to their teaching. Because I think it's that relationship between teachers and students that really starts a growth process between them. So a lot of work in educational consulting across all the different kinds of schools. So inner city schools to private, more elite schools, but things that sort of cover all the bases across education.
And do you see, the field of positive psychology is certainly growing and expanding, and do you feel like your character strength work is expanding along with that?
I think it is growing and expanding. I think that as we discover what the impacts are of this work, I think that more people are more inclined to see how this really heightens their coaching with individuals, and it really heightens their organizational work. And also, if you think about the life satisfaction or the PERMA model, I think it really is the foundational piece of those elements of life that contribute to our life satisfaction.
I have a few comments about those questions. One is, I think the character strengths movement, and I say it's a movement because it kind of feels that way when you start from our perspective, in terms of feeling the momentum, and something that is, it keeps growing in breadth and depth, and it's growing not from a marketing campaign or a sales force. It's growing organically. And so it feels like there's a momentum, a movement. It's resonating with people around the world, and people are taking it and running with it. Now, I think one of the issues with positive psychology is it got co-opted early by the term happiness. And then happiness now has kind of morphed into well-being. Well-being's a lot closer to where positive psychology's heart really is, which is back to what Marty focused on in terms of what Aristotle focused on, which is the good life. What constitutes a good life? We all know that our life isn't a life of happiness, a monotone of happiness. We all know life goes up and down, and we're happy, we're unhappy. We have smooth sailing, we have challenges. And character strengths are as relevant or more relevant during times of challenge.
Well, and as you said before, you they are within us. I'm going to paraphrase or shift this around a little, please correct me. They're within us, but they're not ever present every minute, and we can't access them every minute. And I think that there's a reality frame to what you're saying that's really persuasive. It's if you know that they're there, then you can begin to cultivate and access.
Yeah.
But the goal is not to be all of those strengths all of the time. That's just not reasonable.
Yeah, we don't possess character strengths in perfection. We possess them in degrees, and they're not static, they're dynamic. And so I think the character strengths work really will be leading the field of positive psychology beyond its limits of only looking at, what makes people happy. And and we think that's really important because people encounter a lot in their lives. In terms of what I think the frontiers are for the character strengths work, Donna responded more along the lines of the practice, and in terms of the research, I think that there are a number of, we're really just we're in the infancy of understanding. And of course we knew we would be, and we know the work is really, our work was published in 2004, so it's, here we sit 8 years later. And for anyone who's kind of a student of the history of scientific breakthroughs or innovations, and then the practical applications, it's a decades-long time frame, not a years time frame. And so we're really in our infancy. Now, where we started was as an individual psychology about character strengths in individuals. And I think one of the frontiers really is its power interpersonally. And moving from an individual psychology of character strengths to an interpersonal psychology of character strengths. I think there's as you would expect, we start off identifying 24 character strengths in 6 categories. And so the first step is understanding them as single entities and how they play out and how people can work with them as single entities. But we also, we interviewed once a child in a school up in Newark, New Jersey, the school had been using the character strengths work. And he was, I think, in fourth grade, so he was 10 years old. And he was the one who so eloquently, from the mouths of babes, he so eloquently pointed out that character strengths don't happen in solos. They happen in combinations. And so we have to start understanding that complexity from a scientific point of view. We clinically, in an application, we encourage people to start thinking about, sometimes we call it your secret recipe, or what is it about you? So for instance, if I just focus on 2 of my top strengths, are creativity and perseverance. Now, you could contrast that with, let's say, somebody whose 2 top strengths are creativity and appreciation of beauty.
And they're going to look very different.
They're going to look very different. I'm kind of a business and social entrepreneur, and somebody else might be a painter, or a photographer. And so how we express ourselves, how our character traits come together in constellations. It's kind of like, just as in physics now, one of the frontiers is the multiverse, right? So we've discovered we're not the only universe. There are many universes, and it's kind of like the character strengths is kind of the multiverse of character. And we have to start understanding how do they all interact with each other. And that's going to be a long road, and one that we'll start getting to. And so I think those are 2 of the really important forefronts.
Right.